Hello, welcome to the EPG's Pathshala program in Linguistics. Today we will discuss intonation in Module 28 of the course Introduction to Phonetics and Phonology. Intonation is related to rhythm, which we discussed in the last module. We will find that besides the aspects of rhythm that we discussed in the last module, there are other aspects which interact with intonation. Intonation is a larger area. There are issues that are purely linguistic, and there are also issues that are not linguistic, which are taken into account in discussing intonation. We will, in this module, try to look at 1. How intonation interacts with rhythm. 2. What are the form and function characteristics of intonation. By function we mean how intonation is used for conveying different kinds of information. And lastly, we would look at some other non-linguistic aspects of communication through intonation. There are two senses in which the term intonation is studied. One, a broad sense, and the other, a narrow sense. In its broad aspect, intonation looks at the variations in pitch in relation to other phonetic aspects such as timing, loudness, and voice quality. In the narrow sense, what we mean by intonation is essentially the various changes in the pitch over a word or over a stretch which is larger than a word. There are two aspects to the study of intonation. One, form, and the other, function. Both are complementary, actually intertwined. We looked at the structure of a tone unit in the last module. Recall that a tone unit has essentially 4 components, 4 parts: the nucleus, the center, the obligatory element, and then we have the head, which is the stretch from the first stress to the nucleus, prehead, which precedes the first stress in the sentence in the tone unit, and then tail, which follows the nucleus in the tone unit. We also found that there is another unit which is the stress group. We don't assign it a certain location, but it's easy to see what a stress unit is. Look at the sentence on the screen. John has an important interview tomorrow. In this sentence, the stress groups are, as you can see, John has an important interview to, and then tomorrow. There are 3 stress groups before the nucleus. John has an important interview to. Now, English as a stress time rhythm looks at these stress groups as single units. It is not exactly the constituency of the words, parts, and whole, but rather they, being one phonological unit, that is given importance to. What happens here is then that the stressed syllable gets full prominence, is fully pronounced, but this unstressed syllables tend to have weakened pronunciation, such as reduced vowel, etc., etc., that we discussed yesterday. So the stress group is part of rhythm. However, what we find is that the stress groups can change. And when the stress groups change, based on certain factors dealing with pragmatics, that is the context of communication, then the intonation is also affected. In a short while, we will look at those facts. Now, the part in this tone unit which directly deals with intonation derives its importance from rhythm is the nucleus. As we said, the nucleus is the last stressed item in a word in a neutral context. Now, the nucleus in the sentence we saw John has an important interview tomorrow. The nucleus is more. Now, the nucleus it is which carries the main distinctive tone in this sentence. Thus, it is at morrow that the pitch falls. In a very slow pronunciation, I can read it something like this. John has an important interview tomorrow. You hear the pronunciation of that stretch from last two syllables, tomorrow. So more is the nucleus. Why is it called the nucleus? Because if the tone, instead of falling, if it rises, then the meaning is entirely changed. Thus, I change the tone from falling to rising and look at the effect of the sentence. John has an important interview tomorrow. Tomorrow. What I did was, at more, I gradually rose my tone. Because there are two syllables, so there is no sudden rise of the pitch, but it takes the entire two syllables to rise. Now, as the tone rises, you will notice that it's an entirely different sentence, although the words are the same. John has an important interview tomorrow is a statement. John has an important interview tomorrow is a question. Now, differences in the grammatical form of sentences, such as a statement or a question or a declarative sentence or an interrogative sentence, are crucially conveyed by means of the intonation. Here, crucially dependent on the nucleus, that is, the choice of the specific tone that the speaker employs. We'll look at some other aspects of rhythm which affect intonation. Some of these are quite interesting, and we observe them in our day-to-day conversation, day-to-day communication with our fellow beings. One is what we call pauses. The pauses are extremely important, but sometimes they are grammatically important. For example, in English, we make a distinction between two types of clauses. One is called restrictive clause and the other is called non-restrictive clause. Both are adjectival clauses. Now, the difference between them is, in writing you will notice that when there is a restrictive clause, there is no comma separating the adjectival clause from the noun phrase, from the noun, head noun. For example, my son who lives in Mumbai. If I say my son who lives in Mumbai, that means that I have more than one son. I am talking about the one who lives in Mumbai. My son who lives in Mumbai is coming next week. But if I have more than one son and who lives in Mumbai is only adding information to this, that means my son and who lives in Mumbai does not restrict the meaning of my son, but it is simply an addition. My son who lives in Mumbai is coming here next week. When we pause, then the meaning conveyed is that of non-restrictive. That means something additional. The meaning of son, my son, is not dependent on who lives in Mumbai. Now, notice that the pause is very important here. Now, with the pause also the tone and intonation is important. Now, if we have pauses, then we have three different tone groups. We say, my son who lives in Mumbai is coming here next week. But the other sentence can be said with just one tone group. My son who lives in Mumbai is coming here next week. I find that I would like to take a breath between the sentence somewhere, I can have two tone groups. I can say my son who lives in Mumbai is coming here next week. Both are equally natural. But the important thing is the pause is important for the grammatical meaning of the utterance. Now there are sometimes other aspects to pause that relate to the grammatical meaning of sentences. For example, when we have two nouns such as John and Mary used for a verb, marry, what we find is that if we pause between John and Mary, then the meaning is not exactly what it would be if we don't pause. So listen to these two sentences. John and Mary were married last year. This means John and Mary, they were married to each other last year. When we say John and Mary were married last year, this doesn't convey the same meaning. It means John was married last year and married was married last year, but not necessarily to each other. They could be married to different persons. So the pausing, which gives us different tone groups, the groups which are an aspect of rhythm, has to be sometimes made very carefully so that the grammatical meaning of the sentence as well as its full intended meaning is conveyed. We can give some more examples, but there are quite a lot, so that we will keep talking about pauses. Let's take a look at two sentences. I am not eating it because of its taste. I am not eating it because of its taste. I am not eating it because of its taste. I am not eating it because of its taste, but because of some other reason. Now if I pause, I am not eating it because of its taste, then because of its taste is the main reason. I am not eating it because of its taste, but because of something else. So the reason is something else. It is the pause which crucially distinguishes whether because of its taste is the reason for not eating or there is some other reason for not eating. Now, a careful speaker takes into account these aspects of pauses which play an important role in determining the tone groups in an utterance. Another important area where rhythm and intonation interact is that of focus. Focus is an extremely important aspect of intonation that directly relates to grammar. In fact, it conveys meanings that seem to be intrinsically related to grammar. Now we observed in the last module as well as in this module that the nucleus falls on the last stressed syllable in a word in neutral context. The important expression is in neutral context. But there are contexts all the time in our speech, and it's not always the case that we speak in neutral context. There's always some context where we interact which is at the background, some information which is already available, some information which has to be given, which is new. All these things are found in day-to-day communication. Now, focus is something that draws your attention to new information. Given a sentence such as, John has an important interview tomorrow, what we find is that we can have any of the other stressed words as the nucleus by focusing on it. Suppose the important word is not tomorrow but interview. So John has, it can be meeting or it can be a lecture. What we want to say is that John has an important interview tomorrow, not a meeting or a lecture. Then the focus, the interview is the focus, and the nucleus is the interview. So John has an important interview tomorrow. Then tomorrow becomes the tail. Similarly, when you have, we can talk about important, that is, it is not just a normal interview, but it's very important for John. John has an important interview tomorrow. It's not something which is giving or taking in normal course. And of course, if someone wants to know who it is, who has an important interview tomorrow, he hasn't heard it or he wants to know, or make it very clear, you say John has an important interview tomorrow, not somebody else. So it is the focus. But remember that focus involves two things. One is, of course, extra stress, the most important stress, and the other is the use of the nuclear tone. The nucleus is there. But you should be able to see how rhythm and intonation interact here. The choice of the focus is normally on a word which is normally stressed, a content word. However, in the course of conversation, communication, it is quite likely that the topic of discussion may be a grammatical word. Then that word gets focused. For example, we are going to talk about the article "the" today. Now, then "the," which is a grammatical word, gets focus. So focus is something that can fall on both content and grammatical words, although in the normal course of affairs, it is the content words which are normally stressed that are selected for focus. A distinctive use of pitch over a word or a unit larger than a word is what intonation is. When we look at the phonetics of intonation, we focus narrowly on the pitch changes on the intonational units as well as across intonational units, whether there is a break, whether there is some kind of relationship between tone units. Apart from this, it is not possible to look at pitch in isolation. Often it is bound up with things such as loudness, full vowel quality, and things such as this. So although intonation involves crucially the changes in the pitch, in the production of utterances, we cannot ignore the other aspects of speech which are intertwined with intonation. Those aspects such as loudness or vowel quality or simply intensity, they have to deal with sometimes non-linguistic aspects of communication, such as somebody being angry or disturbed, or somebody being very cool, not warm, etc. All those aspects of communication which also get conveyed with intonation. That's how we said that the use of pitch with other aspects of speech such as amplitude, vowel quality, and loudness, etc., they are equally important. It is necessary, however, for us students of intonation that we keep them somehow separate. We will see how that can be done. Let's take a look at some of the sentences from Hindi, for example, to see what are all the different aspects of intonation that we take into account in looking at its phonetics. One of the things that we observed was the nucleus, the change in the pitch, which affects the grammatical interpretation of sentences. Let's take a look at the oscillogram and spectrogram of a sentence said with two different tones. कल हम वहाँ जा रहे हैं. कल हम वहाँ जा रहे हैं. The pitch tracks in the two sentences bring out clearly the difference between a declarative sentence and an interrogative sentence. another sentence to show how the focus on different words gets expressed through the changes in the pitch tracks. For example, we have the sentence on the screen, कल हम अपने दूसरे घर को देखने जाएंगे. We will go to see our second house tomorrow. Now, as we observed, we can have focus on some other content words in this sentence, such as देखने or घर or दूसरे or अपने. Almost all of these important content words can have the focus. So you notice there are all those different foci on different words, and you look at the pitch tracks and the oscillograms, how they reflect the various changes in the pronunciations of the sentence with different foci, such as कल हम अपने दूसरे घर को देखने जा रहे हैं. कल हम अपने दूसरे घर को देखने जा रहे हैं. कल हम अपने दूसरे घर को देखने जा रहे हैं, etc. The different foci in the spectrograms are shown with the help of an arrow above them. How do we recognize tone groups? You will notice that there is a break in the pitch tracks. Sometimes the pitch may continue, however, it changes crucially from, let us say, it goes high and then it may come down and then start again, etc. We have a sentence which is said with 3 tone groups. Listen to it. Sorry. We have a sentence which is said with 2 tone groups first, and then we see that the same sentence can also be said with 3 tone groups. See how the differences in the tone groups are expressed phonetically. अगर हो सका तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा. You notice that there are 2 tone groups. अगर हो सका तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा. So अगर हो सका is one tone group, तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा is the other one. The longer tone group can also be said with 2 smaller tone groups, such as तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा और तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा. Look at the production of the sentence. तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा. अगर हो सका तो इस काम को मैं आज पूरा कर दूंगा. So much for the phonetics of intonation. We now turn to the phonology of intonation. Part of the phonology of intonation has already been seen in terms of the structure of a tone unit. But what about the structure of an intonational contour? That's the second aspect of intonation. Intonation as such is complete by taking into account rhythm, the rhythmic structure of a tone group, and also by taking into account the structure of an intonation group. Look at the diagram on the screen. On the screen you have 3 different bits of information. One is the representation of the tone groups in the IPA form using certain diacritic marks. The diacritic marks that are commonly used for intonation are certain arrows, certain accent marks. These show which of the words are accented, where exactly the nuclear tone falls, etc. The second line in the diagram has an intonation contour, which is a stylized form of the intonation contour pitch track that you see in the spectrogram. That has been in practice for a long time. These 2 aspects of the description of an intonation contour have come to us for a long time, and they are a legacy of the British structuralist school. The third level of representation has come to us through the theory of autosegmental metrical phonology. The terms such as H for high, L for low, and certain symbols for boundary tones are in wide use today, but these are discussed in greater detail in the course on advanced phonology. For now, we will be contented with the first two lines of the representation of intonation contours, because first of all, the autosegmental level is often matched with the intonation contour level, and secondly, both these lines of representation are still in use today. They are a legacy of the British structuralist school, and they are still in use today. The pitch contours and the use of the various diacritics for describing the intonation patterns in languages are the same for both linguistic expressions as well as non-linguistic aspects of communication. For example, attitude, anger, coolness, or warmth. And it is mainly through the representations at these two levels that we can easily show the difference between statements, for example, which show the warmth of the speaker, or the agitation of the speaker, the intense mood of the speaker, as opposed to, let us say, the coolness of the speaker and the quietness of the speaker, etc. Now, there is no difference in the representation of the phonetic information of or phonological information of intonation here. What we have to see is how to distinguish between the linguistic aspects and the other non-linguistic, emotional, for example, aspects. For the sake of illustration, we will confine ourselves to English language in talking about the functions of intonation, because these have been very well studied for English. We expect that at the end of the discussion, you should be able to think about how intonation is used for expressing different types of meaning, different kinds of meaning in your own language. There are two different intonation contours in English that are the most important and which are grammatically important. Learners of English as a second language cannot do without learning the difference between them. It is thus necessary to see how these two tones are used distinctly for two different grammatical functions. The falling tone. Falling tone is used to express the following grammatical meanings. Statements such as we saw, John is a teacher. It is rather cold today. Secondly, falling tone is also used for questions beginning with WH words like what, who, whom, where, etc., which require an answer in words, unlike in yes/no questions. WH questions, for example, where is the post office? When do we have our exams? Who is coming tomorrow? Now in English, interrogative sentences with all these WH words are normally said with a falling tone. The third type of sentence which is said with a falling tone is exclamatory sentences. For example, how wonderful, what a place, etc. You say this with a falling tone. And lastly, the sentences which are orders or commands are said with falling tone. For example, when you say an officer orders his subordinate, get me the file, get me a glass of water. Now, the use of falling tone in these sentences indicates an order or an authority on the part of the speaker. rising tone, which starts from a lower level and goes up higher level. For example, John, you, etc. The rising tone is used for conveying grammatical information of the following kind. Number one, yes/no questions in English, such as, are we meeting tomorrow? Is he your friend? Have you finished eating? Etc. Now these sentences are by rule said with a rising tone in English. If said with a falling tone, then they sound very rude and thus do not serve the purpose of successful communication. Students of English as a second language, learners of English as a second language, must pay careful attention to the difference between WH questions which are said with a falling tone and yes/no questions which are said with a rising tone. Yes/no questions in general in the other types of sentences generally express something like a politeness. For example, questions which are WH questions, if they are asked with a certain politeness or certain warmth, they can be asked with a rising tone. What is your name? Where do you live? So the difference between where do you live and where do you live is one of warmth or familiarity or extra politeness. But there is nothing wrong with asking WH questions with a falling tone. It's just that if you ask them with a rising tone, then it expresses your concern, your warmth, your closeness with the speaker. Rising intonation also has a discursial function. When you have a long utterance and you have to break it into different tone groups, you often say the incomplete part of the sentence with a rising tone. While crossing the road, I saw my old friend. While crossing the road, I saw my old friend. When you say while crossing the road, you have not completed the sentence. You say it with a rising tone. And then the other sentence, the other part of the sentence is said with a falling tone to complete. So the rising tone can be used to express the incompleteness of an utterance, and falling tone can be used to express the completeness of an utterance. And lastly, rising tones are said for polite requests. Thus in English, a sentence such as shut the door. Now the words that are found in this sentence when said with a rising tone are the same when it's said with a falling tone, but the two convey totally different meanings. Shut the door is a command. Shut the door is a request, is a polite request. Now in this case, the speakers of English often make very careful use of intonation, of the tone. You will find that in polite utterances we have a considerable amount of rising tone. So much so that in the present generation of speakers of English, we find that there is a predominance of rising tone. I met John and I told him, etc., etc. These are called continuation rises, and this is something that seems to be emerging in the present day international English in use. Falling rising intonation is the third one. We said that falling tone and rising tone are the two main tones, but there is another one which is in considerable use, although it doesn't express any grammatical meaning, but it expresses contextual meanings quite often. For example, now let's see how the word will be said in different tones, like falling tone John, rising tone John, and falling rising tone John. Suppose someone asks, how is the new teacher? You will say, he is good. Now what is the meaning being conveyed? Look at the difference between the three sentences. He is good. He is good. He is good. The first is a very clear, strong statement. He is good. The second one is a kind of question. He is good. Perhaps it expresses doubt, but it is a question form. And the last one, he is good, simply means that the speaker has reservations about the new teacher. He is good, all right, but he is not so good. So, without using so many words in English or in other languages as well, you express meanings with the simple use of the falling rising tone. Falling rising tone is used for various types of implications. You take a look at the sentences that are given for exercise and try and see for yourself as to what are the meanings that are implied by those sentences when falling rising tone is used. And lastly, question of intonational variation. In the study of dialects, we find that the variation of intonation can clearly distinguish different dialects within a language. For example, the American English intonation sounds very different from the British English intonation. Simply by hearing the intonation contours, you can tell whether a person speaks dialect X or dialect Y. For Hindi, for example, we often find that speakers who produce Eastern dialects have a different tonal pattern, different intonation contour from speakers who speak the standard dialect. It's a part of our everyday experience to hear the different dialectal varieties of English. More often than not, we can identify a speaker as belonging to different dialects. For example, listen to these two sentences and find for yourself what dialects of Hindi these utterances belong to. आप कल आ रहे हैं? आप कल आ रहे हैं? I leave it at that. Now, to summarize the discussion here, we saw how certain aspects of rhythm interact with intonation and how intonation and rhythm are intertwined. We looked at intonation from two different aspects, the form of intonation and the function of intonation. How intonation is used for expressing various functions. Not everything can be said in the oral presentation here. You will still have to see the text, e-text, for a lot of examples of certain other topics. However, we conclude here the discussion of the prosodic features, stress, tone, rhythm, and intonation. Thank you.